Okay, so Lucinda Miller, welcome to the podcast. It's lovely to be able to connect again.
Oh, Alex, it's great to be with you again. It's been a couple of years, I think.
Yeah, it is. I'm in a new house now. I can think back to our first conversation because it was early on in my sort of first podcast that I set up. So it was all still very new, very nerve-wracking. So I have good memories of our first conversation.
Oh, well, I think it was the second podcast I'd ever done. So again, yeah, it
Wow.
was quite new
Okay.
for me too. So I was a little
Brilliant.
nervous, to be honest.
We hit it well, hopefully. So today's conversation obviously is around sort of kids' health and especially the microbiome and the role that can play within the sorts of conditions you and your team see in clinic. But
Mhm.
before we dive into that, are you happy just to share a little bit about you and your story?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm Lucinda Miller and I'm the clinical lead of Nature Doc. We are a team that's sort of UK wide, so we have clinics in many places across the UK, and we specialise in women's and paediatric nutrition and functional medicine. I was drawn into this mainly because I'm a mum myself. I've got 3 kids, and all 3 of my kids had little issues that all needed sort of ironing out when they were tiny. So the eldest had some dyspraxia and was thought to have attention deficit disorder, and he also had lots of gut issues, which included constipation and soiling, etc. And he really struggled with all of that, and I knew there was a connection between the gut and the brain. And actually, when we did a stool test and other tests, we found a lot of things out of sync in his system. And as soon as we started rebalancing things, his brain started sort of waking up. And there was a moment one day when I said, "Hey Barney, what's going on?" He goes, "My brain's not playing hide and seek anymore. I can concentrate." And it was a really special moment that we'll always remember. And he's now 19. He's at a really good university. He's got lots of friends. He's just, lovely girlfriend. He's in a really good place. And so I'm thrilled that the work we put in then has really benefited him going forward. Then our daughter got bitten by a tick and she developed Lyme's disease. It was fairly short-lived in the grand scheme of things, but it was very scary at the time, and she did need some pretty strong antibiotics. So I was determined to ensure her gut stayed strong throughout that and afterwards. So we did a lot of work with her gut health with bone broths and lots of veggies and lots of probiotics and so forth. And she's pretty robust and great now too. So thank goodness she's all right. And then our youngest had a cow's milk protein allergy, and he actually had something called pyloric stenosis, which meant that he needed an operation at 7 weeks, which was pretty scary. It was opening up the little hole in the bottom sphincter of the stomach to let the milk flow through. And but he still had terrible reflex after that, and it turned out it was the cow's milk protein allergy on top of that. So again, I was really unhappy him drinking Nutramigen, which is the sort of hypoallergenic milk, because it's pretty processed. It's got lots of corn syrup and vegetable oil and all sorts in there. So I was very determined with his weaning to get that really right, so that he was having a really nutritious diet. And we worked on his gut again, and by the age of 3 he was able to tolerate all dairy, and he's our biggest dairy drinker now and loves it and is thriving and happy. So I had the journey with 3 of my children, and of course that really grabbed me, and I love doing general practice and seeing lots of people for everything, but really it was the kids that really just thought, this is an area that's just not being looked at. And I think, it was really hard. So, people ask me every single day, where do I train in paediatric nutrition? I said, there isn't a course. And you just got to pick it up along the way. And, ION, CNN, CNLM, there's only a smattering of bits of children's nutrition thrown in here and there. It's not like there's no dedicated course. So it's something I would love to develop over the next year or 2. So I'm not promising anything, but watch this space. And that's something I would really like to develop, because I feel it's something that is so important. The figures for childhood illness is escalating. It's very scary, really. So leukemia is going up by 1% a year. which is horrible to hear. And then autism rates was, in the 1980s, it was 1 in 10,000. The recent figures, which are Northern Ireland figures, you don't get the UK figures. The UK figures are done every 7 years on adults rather than children, but in Northern Ireland it's quite a good baseline because it's relatively close to here. It's now 1 in, I think it's 23 children, which is 1 in 15 boys. So that's probably 2 boys in a classroom, which is a lot. So I'm pretty passionate about getting children's gut health right from the start. And I've been very lucky that I wrote a book a couple of years ago, hence I think why we were talking then, called The Good Stuff, which is a cookbook for families. I've got my next book coming out next year, which is called I Can't Believe It's Baby Food. And it's a weaning guide helping parents really get their kids on track right from the start.
Brilliant. Well, that's perfect timing for me.
I know, because you're going to be a daddy quite soon.
Yeah.
Which is very exciting.
Excellent. So I guess a question that comes up, Lucinda, without putting you on the spot, but what are some of, I guess, the most common reasons you feel for these spikes in stats, like the frequency at which people are being diagnosed with autism? Are there some sort of big themes that you can sort of just discuss now?
So I think no one really knows the true answer, but as we've all gathered and learned through our functional medicine and nutrition training, that health is a massive puzzle and could not be more applicable when it comes to a neurodevelopmental or neuropsychiatric issue. We do a lot of functional medicine testing on the children that we see. We do stool testing, we'll do amino acids and urine organic acids, we'll do hair testing and food intolerance testing and so forth. And we find some pretty common themes. So we find inflammatory markers, we find dysbiosis in the gut, we find a lot of oxidative stress, we find very low magnesium, very low omega-3, low zinc, and low phospholipids. There are other things as well, but I would say those are the key things. And I know that, obviously we're talking mainly about gut today, but obviously all of those things have an impact on the gut. So just to sort of go through that, phospholipids they form a good working memory. They help with learning. They also help to form your autonomic nervous system, so they help you to emotionally regulate. And a lot of kids that we see have anxiety. They're very heightened. They find it very difficult to sleep and self-regulate. And what's interesting is that lactobacillus, which is one of the main bacteria in our guts, is one of the main building blocks for making acetylcholine. So if a child has been on antibiotics, if they've been dairy-free, because of course there's a lot of lactobacillus in things like yogurt and kefir, then they may be depleted in lactobacillus. And then they're not making their acetylcholine, which is so important for their learning, their memory, and so forth. Lactobacillus is also important because it helps you make GABA, and GABA is your cool, your calm, your relaxed, your inner yogi. And again, very anxious, worried kids who again have been on antibiotics and been dairy-free, etc. You can see a pattern that comes a lot. And when we do the stool test, we find almost always we get very low or no growth of lactobacillus. And this is the thing we work on really hard, because that is so important for their brains and their confidence, their learning, their development, their emotional regulation. All those things are so important. Obviously acetylcholine comes in from diet as well, so choline-rich foods, sunflower seeds and peanut butter and eggs and so forth. But if you imagine, a lot of kids have egg allergies, they might not think about eating sunflower seeds. It's just not part of their thought process. It's not something that's in kids' food. And also, again, there are nut allergies, or they're not allowed nuts at school, so there is less opportunity to have them. So you can see where the choline story can, and choline's just as important as folate for the developing brain.
Okay.
And then, zinc deficiency, for instance. Zinc is absolutely critical for children on so many levels. It helps them grow. It helps them produce all their gastric juices so that they can be hungry and be able to digest their food efficiently and extract the nutrients from everything they're eating. It also develops a really good sense of smell and taste. So it's a big sort of red flag if you've got a very fussy eater. They're often low in zinc. It also helps with immunity, and a lot of them have ear infections, sniffly noses, etc. So, and as I said, it's so important for the gut, and we all know about the healing properties of zinc for the gut. So, zinc carnosine is really important if you've had Helicobacter or gastritis, for instance. So that's such a critical. A lot of people don't think about zinc and the gut; they think of it as sort of immunity, but actually it's so critical for that gut health. And then what else? We see a lot of kids with constipation. I mean, really, really a lot. It's just. I was reading the stats the other day. I think it's over £100 million is spent on constipation in the NHS. Wow. And children's constipation. Yeah, it's enormous. And there are, I can't remember what the figures are, but the number of laxatives that are prescribed are out of this world. Because, of course, a typical child's diet, or what is associated as the typical child's diet, is very beige, it's very bland, it's got no fibre in it. And they might get in the odd bit of fruit or veg, but it's often cucumber sticks or a banana. And yes, the banana's got some little bit of fibre in there, but it's not going to be enough. And again, I think antibiotics are lifesavers. As I said, my daughter needed them when she had Lyme's disease. It was absolutely critical for her recovery. But there is always a backlash when you take antibiotics. And so you need to really have that knowledge base and those skills to be able to go forward and to be able to sort the gut out and replenish things so that there aren't problems later on down the line.
Yeah, amazing. And I guess, some of what you have been mentioning are sort of some of the underlying imbalances that are contributing to that constipation. So whether that's sort of bacterial imbalances or dysbiosis, or nutrient deficiencies to some degree, that are all kind of contributing to those sorts of symptoms.
Absolutely. So, there's a lot of research that links a lack of lactobacillus with constipation. So again, it goes back to that classic picture, and they don't need to be dairy free, obviously, but it's often you get the child that always is having the ear infections and always on antibiotics. They're the recurring infections. Then the parents think, oh, well, maybe I'll take out dairy. Oh gosh, they're a little bit less snotty, that's good, so they take it out. And then later on down the line, oh gosh, they're dyslexic, oh gosh, they're dyspraxic, oh gosh, they've got dyscalculia, oh gosh, they've got attention deficit. And what's really interesting is the common ground with all these things is a poor working memory. So I always, when I talk to the parents whose kids have these issues, I always say, they've got a really fast brain, haven't they? And they go, yeah, it's always just jumping ahead. And I say, it's because they can't keep that information in their brain for long enough. And so their brain's always going back and forth, back and forth. It's a bit like when you're reading a book and you're really tired or really wired and you can't quite take it all in. Because your eyes jumping over the words, and you have to keep on going back to try and remember what you were meant to be reading, and you just can't focus. And that's what the kids experience all the time. So a lot of our work is actually slowing down the brain. So it's getting the fish oil in. The EPA is really good. When they're sort of over 7, we go more EPA because it slows down the brain. Okay. We put in a lot of phosphoserine, phosphocholine, things like that. Again, to calm. The magnesium is really important for calming. The theanine. They often show very high need for taurine and glycine, again, in their organic acids. So a lot of this is, and they're often very high glutamate as well. So you've got all these kids with really heightened, excited, buzzy bodies and buzzy brains. And we have to sort of calm them down to try and help them focus. Because if you think about it, our worlds have become very fast. It's all about social media. Yeah. It's all about immediacy. It's all about stimulation, lots of caffeinated drinks, sweet drinks, stimulating foods. And I think what we see a lot in our clinic is the kids who can't get to sleep. They're often, once they're asleep, they're all right, but you know, parents are trying so hard to get them into these routines of, you know, and they're just, well, I mean, they spend hours over this. You know, we start getting up to bed at 6 and we get them into bed by 7 and they're still awake at 10:30. And this poor parent has usually been lying in bed with this child. This child's like ding, 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 ding. And the parent's just going, I haven't had supper, I haven't put the washing away, but I can't move until this child's asleep. And so we do, you know, really try and sort of get that brain really calm. But as I said, it all comes from the gut. And I'm sure you do all these in your tests, but I'm very interested in also the pathogenic or sort of out of sync bacteria that can be in the gut as well. So I think there's been a lot of emphasis on the missing microbes. So I've talked about the lactobacillus. We find that also, you know, these kids are often low in enterococcus and the E. coli, the good E. coli, the bifidobacterium, the Akkermansias and so forth. So we very much build on those. And there's a great researcher called Leo Galland, you must be very aware about, who's written a brilliant paper on the connection between all the different microbes and the different parts of the brain and the different neurotransmitters. So some influence your serotonin pathways, some influence your dopamine pathways, your adrenaline pathways. So again, we look, and if they're depleted, we'll build on those, and often you get a better balance of adrenaline or a better balance of serotonin or whatever. So that's sort of the underlying sort of gut sort of depletions. And then obviously we've got the depletions of stomach acid. We often do the bicarb test just to see what's going on there. I'd say a very high number of the kids that are really struggling with whatever, whether it's learning or growth or just behavior, often have very low pancreatic elastase. So for pancreatic elastase, if people don't really know what this is, it's basically the enzyme output from the pancreas that helps you to digest and break down all your nutrients. So they produce lipase to break down fats, and then all these proteases and things to break down the proteins into amino acids, and then the sugar, then the starches into sugars, etc. So it's very complicated, but it can vary dramatically. And there's a measure called pancreatic elastase, and it's meant to be over 200, but from a functional medicine perspective, ideally it's over 500 to be really, really well, and to be able to efficiently extract all the nutrients from what you're eating. So, and of course, kids often eat in a rush, they don't chew their food terribly well, or, you know, they're going straight from microwave food straight in, so they're not smelling or, you know, enjoying those kitchen smells beforehand. So they're not producing these gastric juices. So pancreatic elastase, as I said, should be over 200, but we're generally find them around 100 for a lot of the children who are struggling. And some we're getting as low as in the 20s, and we've had one which was 0. Yeah, which is pretty scary. So they need a lot of help with their pancreatic output. And so we work really hard on the chewing, on the stomach acid production, and then because that stimulates that pancreatic enzymes to be produced and the secretin to balance all the acids from the stomach and so forth. But that is a critical area. And I say, look, and it's often the families say, we feed our child so well, but they're just not growing. You know, little Jimmy had 6 sausages for breakfast, but he's still, you know, 5 inches smaller than any of the other kids in the class. He's desperately hungry all the time, and he's feeding, but it's because it's just not breaking down properly. So we work really, really hard on that. And that's such a critical part of the gut health that gets ignored a lot. And we find that we then often refer back to the gastroenterologist saying, look, this is what's happened. And they go, oh my gosh, we wouldn't have even thought about that. That would have been one of the very last things that we'd have done. And by that point, they've done endoscopies, colonoscopies, they've done all these things, but they haven't just checked the basics of pancreatic elastase.
Wow.
And the NHS can prescribe Creon, which is, you know, an equivalent digestive enzyme, and then they're monitored more closely. So, you know, we often do that, but in the meantime, say, look, we've got the equivalent, but you have to pay for it, obviously, but we can do it just to keep them going. And that can be revolutionary to a child. Absolutely amazing. It can just transform them, because of course they're suddenly getting all the good food from what they're eating, all the good nutrients, all the brain foods. So that's really critical part of the gut health. And these are all the depletions. But equally, we're also finding that there's a massive overgrowth of microorganisms in the gut that shouldn't be there.
Okay.
So we're finding quite heightened commensal bacteria. So commensal bacteria is, you should have some of these things in your gut, but when there are too many of those, then that can cause an imbalance compared with if there's very low lactobacillus and all those good guys, and there's not enough, and there's too many of the bad guys, that's an imbalance called dysbiosis. And again, there's been a lot of research into some of these individual microorganisms. So we do a lot of work with kids with something called pandas, where streptococcus can cause an autoimmune effect on the brain, triggering anxiety, OCD, tics, etc. And we often find very high levels of strep in the gut. Now, that doesn't confirm pandas, but it will then send us down the line of organising blood tests to see whether pandas is a thing for them.
Okay.
And we do find that generally those that have a lot of strep in their gut are the more anxious type, even if they don't have marked, profound pandas. If we bring down those levels of strep, they are much more balanced, less sort of black and white, less stressy, less anxious, etc. So we find that a really good marker. We find there's a lot of Klebsiella, and they're often the kids that love their carbohydrate, and that feeds Klebsiella. But that and something called Clostridia are linked with autism type guts. So they find a lot of those in the autism guts. Okay. And they're very neurotoxic. They produce lots of toxins when they break themselves down, and so of course they then go to the brain and cause problems. So again, there is research to find that when you reduce the levels of Klebsiella and the Citrobacter, and then there's this Clostridia, that the autism is less profound, it's less marked. So we find that really, really interesting. And again, we look out for these kinds of things in the stool tests.
Brilliant.
And then you've got yeast overgrowth. Oh my goodness, the yeast overgrowth. So if you can imagine, what's the side effect of taking antibiotics? It's getting thrush. And most women associate obviously that vaginally. But again, in the mouth, they might get a white tongue. They're breastfeeding, the little baby might get thrush in their mouth, and they might have it on their nipples and so forth. So that's where people associate sort of yeast and thrush and so forth. But actually what we find is that if it's in the mouth and it's down below as well, it's going to be in between. There's a connection between the two. And what's really interesting is that yeast, when it's in the gut, ferments and turns into ethanol, which is alcohol. And again, a lot of kiddies that we see that are very out of sync are quite unpredictable, and they're quite up and down. Their mood can be very high and then very low, which is very like those blood sugar highs and lows that people have when they're hungover. They're fine one minute, then really terrible the next, then high and low. And we call this the yeast beast because these kids go hyper silly. They often laugh to themselves, laugh for no reason, just, as I said, really hyper and then really aggressive. And they're just totally volatile, basically. And again, once you get that yeast under control, then we find a much better balance. And that's again by getting the good guys in and reducing the yeast overgrowth. And we just get a much more even child. The trouble is, because modern diets are so full of refined sugar and flours and pro-inflammatory yeast feeders, that you have to be quite on it with the diet to help really clear it entirely. And we find that families can probably do it for 6 months, maybe a bit longer, but then after that it starts waning a bit. So you've got to really say, this is so important to get it right now, because if the more we can get rid of, the less likely it's going to be a problem later on down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. And what about a couple of other markers that come to mind would be sort of secretory IgA when we're thinking about that mucosal immune system, and how frequently you see just sort of frank inflammation with maybe sort of elevated calprotectin?
Yeah, so with the secretory IgA, we see a mixture of low and high. So the low is usually indicative of well, I always describe it as a very low immune system, a low gut immune system, vulnerable to these bugs coming in and taking over, vulnerable, harder to get over infection, but also more susceptible to food intolerances. So when that's low, we will then possibly investigate a food intolerance panel, or go down that route, and also to build on that secretory IgA, so to put in something like Saccharomyces boulardii and zinc and vitamin A, and build on that mucosal lining, and also to just have the conversation about histamine and food sensitivities and so forth, and see if we can build on that oral and gut tolerance. Because my big mission with all the kids that we see is for them to end up on a normal diet. And because I know how horrendous it is, so limiting to have to always worry about whether something's going to be dairy free or gluten free or egg free. And as I said, people are fine to begin with, and they get really fed up. There's a sort of, it's almost like a bereavement process with these food intolerances. They're like so desperate, their child's in bits, so they go, yeah, we want to do the test, and oh, hooray, it's dairy and egg, hooray, take it out. And like, oh, panic. What am I going to feed them? Okay, found those things that they like, right, we're on an even keel, all good. And then it's like, oh, they're going to a party, or we're going on holiday, or we're whatever. Oh my gosh, what if it's in the hotel food? What if? And so there's this massive panic with that. And then they'd start getting really fed up. And then often after that, like most bereavements, they go into that wonderful calm of, okay, acceptance, this is the rest of my child's life, etc. But you do have these fighters, as I said, these warrior parents who go, right, I'm not going to let us get to that stage. I want my child to be able to eat everything. And so I'm on that mission. I can't promise the parents this. I really can't. I don't know their child's destiny. But what I can say is that we will do our absolute utmost to get them as tolerant as possible. And even if that means having an ice cream and having a slightly sore tummy afterwards, but not horrendous diarrhea and that's okay, because they've made that choice. And when they're older, they can make that choice. They want want to be a little bit uncomfortable, or they might not be uncomfortable at all. We don't know, but still, it's educating them and giving them the tools that can help them to tolerate that thing, or to, as I said, work on that underlying gut whilst it's developing, so that it becomes more bulletproof. Because we all know this wonderful saying, it's not the food's fault. And I mean, you will experience this in your clinic. All these people come in and you say, what do you eat? And they go, we're gluten-free, we're dairy-free, we don't eat red meat, and we don't do this, and we don't do that. And I say, what do you eat? And they go, and it's the same thing every single day. And they're frightened of food. And I don't want people to be frightened of food. I mean, I've always wanted my children, we can't travel at the moment because we're in a lockdown, but going forward, I want my children to travel around the world and be able to sit at anybody's table and go, yes, please, that would be delicious. Rather than go, oh, I couldn't, do you mind? I'm really sorry, I can't. And obviously not everyone can do that. And I'm very fortunate my children don't have something like celiac disease or a profound nut allergy. I'm really, really blessed with that. But we have all of that in our family. And so I know they've got shocking genetics. So I worked, again, that was one of my missions when they were little, to get their guts right and get them tolerant of these foods right from the start, so that they've got this life without limits, without food limits anyway. And so that's what I try and do. And as I said, I can't promise anything, but that's, I'm a foodie at the end of the day. I love food. I want everyone to have a really amazing relationship with food, and I think it's all got far too stressful.
Definitely. For something I've been reflecting on a lot recently is just this basic idea that we have never known more about the human body, health, how to get well, but we've also probably never been as confused as we currently are. And I think part of that is just coming back to the fundamentals. I think humans seem to, a certain conversation I've had, have a tendency to ignore the basics and the fundamentals, thinking that there's some complicated route to becoming really well and robust. But it's coming back to some of those basics. And I think at heart, we're all foodies to some degree. We're all on the spectrum, but having, so to speak. But, looking back through my journey of having lots of different food reactions and gut issues, I'm kind of really grateful that I never fully went down the rabbit hole of strict elimination over long periods of time. Because I think you end up in that sort of hypervigilant state, don't you? Whereby you almost, I have been here, which is having almost a reaction to a food before even having it. Because there's almost like that alarm bell going off in the body that this is coming on boards, get ready kind of thing. And like you say about smelling, tasting, looking at our foods. I was speaking to Dr. Jenny Goodman on the podcast recently, and we were talking about that cephalic phase of digestion.
Brilliant.
And I like stats. Numbers make a difference to how I relate to information, I think. And I found a paper talking about how 25% of pancreatic elastase approximately is produced in that first phase of digestion when we're not chewing, it's not in our stomach yet. It's basically when we should be cooking our food and taking in those senses. So it's a really profound part of the digestive process. And how often are we grabbing a sandwich from the petrol station on our way to the next business meeting, or microwaving lunch and not really having that opportunity to use the senses?
Sure, that is amazing. 25%, I had no idea that. I knew it was a significant amount, but that is a lot.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm going to emphasize even more to our parents of the kids with the low pancreatic elastase.
Yeah. And it's not surprising, I guess, thinking about how everything you said before that point around stomach acidity, around sort of small, large intestine health, and that kind of busy, active brain, when we appreciate, the vagus nerve is what is largely innervating the pancreas to produce those enzymes. So that whole parasympathetic branch, the rest and digest branch of our nervous system, is what's really contributing to that pancreatic elastase production overall.
Absolutely. And so it's helping the children sleep properly, so that they're hungry in the morning for their breakfast. And they're it's, as I said, it's the whole child is the most important thing. It's not individual areas, but it's hard to take that all on board. And some people just want to be able to do one or two things. And that's why it's a journey, and that's why it's exciting working with these families. And it's why I do a lot of social media and blogging and write books, because actually I think then that can provide that information for people who are interested and want to really branch into this and do it more seriously. Whereas there are a lot of people looking obviously for a quick fix, and that's fine. But it's great to educate people, and I love that education side of my work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So out of curiosity, what kind of age do you go down to with your stool testing?
So most stool tests are meant to be from sort of 2 years up. But to be honest, we do start them from about 6 months, but only in very individual cases. It would be very much where there would be a profound gut issue right from the start, or just maybe a parent with terrible gut issues themselves who's breastfeeding, or just lots of eczema or something where the poor little baby is very, very sick. But generally we're looking a little bit older. I'd say the most of the kiddies that we see in the clinic probably are from about 10, 11 months onwards. So they've sort of muddled along through the first year. They've seen various pediatricians and been put on different milks and things, and they're still not quite right. Or the parents are struggling with the weaning. And often that's also when they start getting their first sort of illnesses as well, or the nappies just aren't right. It's often around then rather than earlier, but occasionally, I think what it mainly is that we would possibly be seeing the older child anyway, and then the mum would come in and say, look, I really want to sort my baby out right from the start. What should we do? Rather than a new fresh person coming in with a brand new baby as a first sort of port of call.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really good to know. Brilliant.
And then you were asking a little bit about calprotectin as
Yes.
well, and inflammation markers. And I just want to share my thoughts on this. And I hope this comes across in the right way. Interestingly enough, calprotectin is a marker for inflammation of the gut, and it's what the medics will look at when they're looking to see whether there is an inflammatory bowel. It has to be extremely high for the medics to action anything at all. And we have found that even when it is extremely high, if there isn't mucus or blood, again, they might not do much. So we had a little boy a few years ago now who had, in the thousands, his calprotectin was in the thousands, lots of blood and mucus shown in the stool. He was under a gastric paediatrician, and their prescription was come back in 6 months' time.
Wow.
And this happens a lot. So I just wanted to share that with people, that not much action is done. I think they're hoping, they don't want to put the child on medication. I think that's what it is, because once they're on the medication treadmill, it's pretty difficult to get off it. And I think that once, and they're hoping that maybe with the immune system maturing and the gut immune system becoming more tolerant and so forth, that it will calm down on its own. Obviously, if the child's not growing, they'll put something in straight away. So they're very keen on looking at growth and weight, but not necessarily whether they actually are thriving and are happy and are sleeping and in pain. That doesn't seem to be so important to them. It's more the growth. And this is meant to be a derogatory thing. It's just what I've observed. And there are obviously, each paediatric gastroenterologist is going to work in a slightly different way, but this is just our experience over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to share with your listeners that even if they are waiting for medical advice or medical tests, action can be taken in between, and that they can change the diet, they can consider seeing a functional medicine practitioner, they can consider doing stool tests, they can consider doing supplements, because I just think to let a child be in pain, to be in discomfort, to alter their mood or their sleep or whatever for a long period of time, I think is worse for them than to wait to see really what it is. And actually, as I said, the action is not often there right from the start. And also, there are long waiting lists as well. So often you're waiting, especially right now with lockdown and so forth. You could be waiting several months, if not a year, to get those investigations done, and often that involves an anaesthetic, and then having a colonoscopy or an endoscopy, which is not fun, and a lot of people aren't prepared to do that. So that's where I think the power of our tests are so important, because it's looking at the gut in a 360 way. It's looking at all this. And what's great is it will highlight if there's a real problem, and then you can fast track. You can say, oh my gosh, the calprotectin's through the roof, there is blood, there is mucus, I really think you need to press the button on this. I think we need to move this forward fast. And that's great. You can then either write to the GP or ask them to go and see them, or we've got a whole bank of paediatric gastros that we can refer to, and we can do that, and that's great. But I think that if you're hesitating, wondering whether some magic's going to happen, we haven't found much success so far. As in, the treatments are Movicol for constipation, and there's one called Cosmovicol now, and then what else? Sometimes paraffinol, again for constipation. There's omeprazoles and lansoprazole and things like that for the stomach acid and the reflux. But as you know, there's been a lot of research into the reduction of the diversity of the microbiome when you take long-term PPIs. So that ends up with other issues later on down the line. what else do they do? You know, not much else. You know, a lot of it's wait and see, or you've got this. We can't chop anything out, but you've got this.
Right.
And, you know, but I think that's where we're so lucky. We've got this really huge toolbox. And if one thing isn't working, we can try another and another and another. And, you know, it's very exciting. And eventually we generally get there. I can't promise the world, but we generally do. And you found that in your practice too. And that's why I think our world is so passionate about what we do, because we actually do see real gains in the health of our clients.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess a question that I'm itching to ask based on all of that information, and you've touched on this already in regards to certain nutrients and foods that are good sources of some of those nutrients, but I guess a question that a lot of people might be wondering about listening to this is, what would you say from a generalized perspective, obviously, because you'll be personalizing it for your client, but what are some of the general rules, for want of a better term, that we want to be considering from a kiddie's nutrition perspective?
Okay, so first of all, I would say take the nutrition during your pregnancy really seriously and get you really healthy during that pregnancy. So, you know, ditch the Diet Cokes, start eating all the good stuff like, you know, oats and seeds and nuts and lots of eggs and lots of choline rich foods and good quality fish and so forth, and really just veggies and really getting those habits set, because once you've had the baby it's much harder, and it's, you know, suddenly old habits come creeping back, so, and which is very normal. But if you've got those habits set in stone and you know what's in your shopping basket or in your Ocado shop or whatever, then those things will come back into your house and you still continue to use them. So getting good habits, because the mum's microbiome is critical for the baby's microbiome. So not everybody chooses to breastfeed, but what generally happens is that if you do breastfeed, the baby will get the balance of microbes that are in your gut in their gut, because there are these dendritic cells that basically get passed like a sort of channel between mummy's gut and the back of the breast. And so mum's microbiome will be passed, as I said, a bit like the nutrition. Everyone knows about the nutrients coming through the breast milk, but it's also that balance of microbes. So if you can get your balance of microbes right when you're pregnant, then that's going to be helpful for the balance of bacteria in your breast milk for your baby. So working on that, I think, is really critical. No one can really control what kind of birth they have. I mean, I think a lot of people intend to have a natural birth, but the number of people I know who've really wanted a natural birth but haven't been able to is so, I mean, the percentage is so high that, you know, I think it gets people then start feeling really guilty that they've had a C-section and haven't built this right microbiome. But I just think you can do everything about it afterwards. So just the most important thing is the health of you and your baby. But, you know, if, you know, you really want to have a natural birth, which I think is important, I was very lucky I was able to have 3 natural births, is I did hypnobirthing, which I found was fantastic. And I did a lot of yoga and a lot of stretching. I got very into the Gary Mothy method, which is she's called the gentle birth method, and again she does lots of exercises for stretching and allowing the baby, you know, to have a natural birth. So I worked on that really hard because I was passionate about having it. But so there are methods and ways, but obviously everyone's different. But if you can have a natural birth, that's great. Give your best shot at breastfeeding. I found it really, really hard. I'd say it was the hardest part of parenthood for me personally. And I wasn't built to be a cow, but I did my best. And, you know, at least I gave my children the beginnings of breast milk. I'm not saying I did it forever, but research has found that if you can breastfeed even for 2 days, that makes a massive difference.
Wow.
So just give your best shot if you can. And then going forward, if you do need antibiotics or your baby needs antibiotics, is for you to obviously supercharge your diet again with lots of good fermented foods and cultured foods and probiotics, and again give the baby some probiotics too, because you're not going to be able to replenish that very easily in the baby, even if, especially if you're formula feeding, because there's only occasionally one strain of probiotic in the infant milk now, and actually we need, as everyone knows, you need a diversity of different bacteria. So I would consider a baby probiotic if your baby needs antibiotics in the first 6 months.
Okay.
And then really going forward, once you're weaning from 6 months, which is around 6 months anyway, is to take a very good whole nutrition approach to weaning and think that every single mouthful does count, and to try and get as many good nutrients into the food. So once you've gone through the first couple of weeks of getting fruit and veg and things like that in, the simple foods, just to check for allergens and check that they are able to swallow and all these important things, is then to step up quite quickly by adding in eggs and nut butters and seeds and, all ground up, obviously, so you can't choke on them, getting lots of lovely oily fish in there, getting lots of iron-rich foods, and really getting into the flow of those real whole foods right from the beginning. And then building those habits and those smells in the kitchen for the baby, and building up their gastric juices to enjoy their food rather than straight out of a pouch. Which is instant, no smells, no essential fatty acids, no protein, no iron, all these important things. Those pouches don't have very much in them, unfortunately. They fill a gap, but they're not highly nutritious. Some are a little bit better than others. And then hopefully going forward, if you can build those habits of cooking from scratch, cooking variety, lots of different colours and vibrancy and different ingredients in there, the child's going to have a really good start to life, and you're probably going to avoid a lot of the ups and downs along the way.
Brilliant. No, that's really helpful, and I'm looking forward to seeing the new book come out in the new year. Is there a release date yet?
It's going to be in May, as far as I know at the moment. I'm hard editing at the moment, so I'm trying to get it through, and then we'll get the photos done quite soon, which is exciting. Amazing. And they'll be beautiful, I'm sure, and really, really sort of delicious and inspiring.
Brilliant. Is there anything we haven't covered that you think is important to cover?
I just think the most important thing for parents to realise is it's never too late to change a person's gut. And as you know, you're seeing adults who have never looked after their gut, and suddenly they are, and they're seeing transformations in their gut health and their general health. So I think people have the fear, have they got it wrong? Is it too late? And just to say, it's never too late to feed them the good stuff. And, there's always room for change. And a child's brain is developing until they're in their mid-20s. So even if you've got a teenager who's being all over the place, you can do something about it.
Good to know. Lucinda, thank you so much for sparing some time to come and share all of your experience and knowledge. I think it's going to be another very popular episode, so thank you.
Oh, it's been lovely, Alex, and take care and good luck with the baby.
Thank you.